just a couple of comments to make at the start. And I know we're living in interesting times and lots of challenges coming at us out of Wellington and other places. And just to give you a bit of a quick overview of Southland, I'm sure you've talked about Southland and from a deer farming perspective, from water quality and a land use perspective, and also just in terms of the importance of the rural sector, the regional sector to Southland. So in terms of economy, the rural sector really, really important, much more so than any other region in the country. I think our GDP is about 20% comes out of that rural sector, as opposed to most regions 10 to 12. So the rural sector, including deer farmers, really important to Southland, and that makes it really critical that whatever we do in that environmental space recognises that. We've got big environmental challenges. We've got water quality, especially in our lower catchments, that's not in great shape, and our estuaries aren't in good shape. So that's the confronting stuff, actually, and we've done a lot of work in the last 10, 15 years to address that, to do better at that. We haven't had, even though there's a lot of good stuff going on, and the some areas where actually water quality is good, and of course a big chunk of the region is Fiordland and other pristine areas where the water quality is fantastic. But we've also got in our developed areas, especially in the low catchments where it all ends up, it's not great and the dials are going the wrong way. So that's our challenge. That's what we've got to get on top of. So when I talk to people and I talk to my staff, we've got some drivers around. We need to get better environmental outcomes, but we need to do it in a way that maintains confidence in that rural sector and confidence that sector's got a huge future and is part of a thriving Southland going forward. So those are the two drivers, and I don't think we can do one without the other. So if we focus just on environment without actually making sure our community is with us and there's confidence, we're not going to get those environmental outcomes because we're not going to get them just through regulation. We know we are going to need to have those communities, those industries, such as yourselves, on board and looking at how do we minimise our impacts. So that's just a bit of a starter to sort of set the scene. Look, so one of our areas is winter grazing. So we've got a fantastic climate down here for growing grass. It's the best in the country. I don't come from Southland. I've been here 8 years. I actually come from the North Island, from Wanganui. Spent some time in Canterbury and in Taranaki, and I thought Taranaki grew grass pretty well, but came down here and just was amazed. But we have a long winter, and so we've got to look at some wintering systems, including with cropping, that actually does create risks. And the risk is around sediment. So we can have some good winters, and then we'll have a period of miserable weather. There's nothing surer than sometime in the winter we'll get a storm come through, or two. And those from Southland will be all nodding their heads. I know that's hard to believe on this gorgeous summery day, but so those are challenging times. So it's always been one of those things, that and what was acceptable 10 years ago is not acceptable anymore. So we've got to work hard at how do we get better wintering systems. So I've got a PowerPoint here. I'm not too sure if it's on the screen. Yes, it is. Look at that. 2019, as this came to a head, I'm not sure, some of you will remember this, and certainly the Southland farmers will. And we had a storm early August, and we had some activists in the Waikato, and we had got some local activists who brought things to a head. Now, they'd been sharing photographs all over the country, including Wellington. In previous years, I'd gone to meetings and sort of been confronted with these, so what are you doing about this, Rob? And I'd be looking at half the photographs were from the Pomahaka or from other parts of South Otago, not Southland, but didn't seem to matter to some people. And there's nothing wrong with the Pomahaka. They do great stuff there. But it was interesting. So people take photographs, they share them around. This gained momentum in 2019. Where's the power? Have we got something I can play with? The green button. Green button, yeah. Look at that. So a messy one. It was a messy year. So it was good year up until 1st of August, I think it was. And then we had a really period of tough rain. We had some activists who were taking photographs. And so they weren't that flash. And so anyone from Southland knows that actually when there's rain, there's some things that aren't too flash. And I remember driving to Dunedin the following weekend, driving up the main road, and every second paddock I seemed to come to had winter grazing and wasn't looking very good. And I'm thinking, well, why do people put winter crops beside main roads? But that's beside the point. But you can see actually there was some pretty confronting stuff going on. Cows and a lot of it was around cows and mud. I don't see too many photographs of deer, to be fair, but certainly cows, and that got the interest going. We had we had some demonstrations. We had a demonstration outside work, and it was interesting. We had calls for my resignation. So Rob Phillips should resign. So this was national media. Rob Phillips should resign because he hasn't got on top of winter grazing. So it got personal. It was interesting. And that's sort of the tactic, I think, of the activists. They really want to make a difference. And it certainly worked with me, got my attention to it anyway. And thank goodness my council didn't agree. And I see one of my councillors sitting down there, so I'm hoping he agrees as well. So, yeah, look, it was interesting. And, look, they raised this with Minister. I gather ministers were coming back from being away on a trade thing at the time. And in Auckland Airport, they were confronting with these images. Damien O'Connor and in particular, and so he formed I think an action group that Lindsay is going to talk about shortly. I understand, although we haven't talked, we were going to talk. We didn't quite get to that space, but so it got the minister's attention as well, and he formed an action group. At the same time, there was some stuff going on in Southland. We had a kindergarten that had some sediment from an adjoining paddock just flowed over. It just was a bit of a moving mass, and that was less than helpful. So that made the media. We did some compliance monitoring flights that year. We found there were 95 areas we need to follow up. So there wasn't a great picture at all. And out of those... out of those 95 flights, there were 8 farmers were found to be had significant non-compliance, i.e. there was sediment going into waterways, and we took a number of infringement notices, and we took 3 prosecutions. So this is getting serious. They were prosecuted and successfully prosecuted. So this is part of how do we change that behaviour, and the heat was on. But we also recognise that actually we can only make changes if we get together with industry and others. So we got a hui together in September, October that year with industry, including, I think Lindsay was there, and also some of our local farmers were part of that conversation, and looked at actually we can do better here going forward. We had to do better. There was Southland's reputation was at stake. So that was a really positive exercise, and we had MPI obviously in that tent as well. So it was great to see industry stepping up and taking some real leadership roles, saying actually our industry, and I'm sure yours was the same, can actually do better here. And I'm not picking on industries here, by the way. This was a Southland issue, but we all had to do it. We all were in there together. And again, I go back to those things, the comments I made earlier on. We need our primary industries to be the best they can if Southland's going to thrive in the future, and we can get on top of our environmental challenges. So out of this hui came an action plan. So we held the pen, but we didn't drive it. So this is a joined-up action plan. What was everyone going to do going forward to actually make a difference? So I was very impressed, but thinking we've got to actually get some runs on the board and see that change. So in the 2020 year, we did some flights, and look, it was pretty clear to us. We did some flights early on in the season to see what sort of evidence there was in terms of where farmers were putting some winter grazing paddocks, sort of setbacks, all of those things. And look, we were impressed. There was evidence of a widespread uptake of good management practices that was needed. And we had only 19 incidents that we needed to follow up. So we did out of those flights, as opposed to 95 the previous year, 19. And we had 3 farmers who were deemed to have significant non-compliance, and we didn't take any prosecutions. So there was some follow-up, but actually no prosecutions. I was as part of the industry stepping up. They had their own 0800 number, and also we had the different organisations all working together with their respective organisations, so we weren't tripping over each other. There was. We've got scarce resources in Southland, so it's really critical that we are all working together on this stuff. So it was great. It was really, really good. So the forward planning was impressive, and we're seeing more of that sort of going into this year as well. Look, as you remember last year, we also had some national policy statements for freshwater and a national environment standard coming in for freshwater as well, which included some regulations aimed at winter grazing. We didn't think they were terribly helpful. They targeted, in our view, the wrong stuff. We had a new word come into the New Zealand language, pugging. So they put a lot of emphasis on pugging, and so all of a sudden we had this term pugging, and everyone's wondering what they're talking about. But farmers know about pugging, but not many other people do. But it became part of the language. You've got to stop pugging. Now, actually, we've got to focus on the sort of problem and the outcomes. If you're going to have livestock in the winter, you'll have some pugging. There's nothing sure. What you don't want to do is have that sediment flowing into waterways. That's what we want to be focused on. So we had another hui. We got the ministers down, and again talked about this and talked about what we'd achieved, but also that this wasn't helpful. So we formed another group, and I'm not a great fan of committees, but actually this is a really good committee. It had all of the players on there, and again we held the pen. We didn't drive it. This is industry driven. The key thing is with this group we had fish and game in there. Now, fish and game and Environment Southland don't always, it'd be fair to say, sometimes there's quite a bit of tension in the relationship. But man, that was a key to our success with this one. So we had a guy in there who understood the science, he knew the Telford research, he knew about what actually causes a problem, and he became a key spokesman for us. We had a session, so they produced a report around here's what some regulations should look like going forward. We presented that in Wellington in December, and the lead guy for us was, I won't mention names, but out of fish and game. And it was impressive. And we had a Southland team there, and he was leading the charge. Now, that was something I wouldn't have predicted, but it was certainly carried the day. And so, look, you would have seen the results. The ministers have agreed to put this off for a year while they actually look at what's required and what's sensible going forward. And again, I keep on pushing this thing. We've got to look at outcomes. How do we make a difference? And that's the key for me. And I guess the key part of that advice was around let's focus on critical source areas. That's where the sediment's going to come from. And let's have a farm plan module. I hear the conversations about some privacy, but a farm plan module. Not too sure how that fits into that conversation, Lindsay, but we can talk about that as part of that solution going forward. So, look, I'm confident that the minister's listening, and he's aware that actually Southland's doing a lot of work in this space. And when I say Southland, I'm not talking about Environment Southland, I'm talking about Southland Inc. So, and that's critical for us. And again, going back to, this is one part of addressing our water quality challenges. So, look, I'll perhaps leave it there. But just going back to that main point, we've got real challenges here in Southland. We've got to achieve better environmental outcomes, but we've also got to maintain confidence and trust with our rural community, and a real confidence that they've got a big future here and are going to continue to be part of a thriving South. So I'll leave it there. Does anyone have any questions? Or do you want to take questions at the end, Lindsay? Yeah. Do you want to do Lindsay's first and then have questions? How do you want to work it?
Yes, we'll do Lindsay's. Yeah.
Oh, Lindsay, how are you going? Good, thanks. Nice to see you. Good to see you too.
Okay, so thanks very much. It's actually not Veterinary Association, it's Vet Council, so I just need to correct that because the New Zealand Veterinary Association will get a bit snotty about it. So by way of training, I'm a veterinarian and started in Rangatiki, actually, back in the mid-70s. And so one of my first introductions to new species was some fairly wild deer at that time, and trying to determine actually how to remove antlers, how to remove velvet. So it was right back in those early days of silly things that perhaps we may have done at the time, and some quite interesting drugs that we were using to try and actually achieve the right outcomes. But in fact, those outcomes were achieved and they've been developed and refined. And so I'd like to say thank you first to the conference for the invitation to talk to you. Subsequent to dealing with veterinary practice, I've been involved in the dairy industry, but also heavily involved in animal welfare and farm to process animal welfare forum. And then, as mentioned, we had an event 2019 where there was a lot of attention being applied to grazing practices, particularly in Southland, and that got a lot of media attention, and we've had a lot of discussions around it already this morning, so I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on that, but it did invoke some actions, and one of it was, as the minister as described, the minister, which is the button I press, okay. So the minister established a task force, which is a normal response when something's going wrong. You get someone to go and have a good look at it. And that was chaired by John Hellstrom, who used to be the Chief Veterinary Officer for New Zealand and was chair of NAWAC. And John, with the team, which was a government and industry grouping of people with an interest or expertise in the area, came up with a set of recommendations, and that's very fine. So you've got a report. And then they said, well, what are we going to do with this? And so the minister decided that he had actually set up a working group called the Winter Grazing Action Group, which is to give effect to the recommendations of the task force. So that is where the rubber started to hit the road a little. And I know people have asked what it's done and also what its scope of activities are. So it's not been a Southland specific action group at all. What it is, it's got a national responsibility. It will have a finite duration, which probably won't go beyond the end of this year or early next year, because what it's done is it's taken the task force recommendations, it's looked at those and said, well, what are the sensible things we can actually achieve right now? So we've got a big challenge, and sitting alongside the challenge of the mud and the pugging, and what does pugging actually look like, and all the discussions in Wellington, all around the country, we got to a point where it said, right, we're not going for regulations. It's not appropriate. What we need to be very clear about are what are the short-term outcomes that need to occur alongside also dealing with the environmental issues that are being brought forward through a number of regulations and various discussions that are occurring. Now, one of the pleas that I would have right through or here, but also just in terms of general comms, so we're talking about a farm, it's a system. You can't silo it into little segments and say, we'll do this here, we'll change that over here. And the group that's doing that there, the group that's saying do that over there, if they're not talking to each other and not understanding the consequences of doing it, then you'll end up with perhaps some good things happening, but you'll also end up with some unintended outcomes. And so those unintended outcomes can be quite significant. And I'll come back to two or three of those as we go through, but just need to recognise that what's important is that we understand what we're trying to achieve in terms of outcomes without necessary regulation. Regulation may be required to take the bottom end along, but it's actually what's required, but it's also the why and a good understanding of that. Rob mentioned the world has changed. It's always changing. And I've seen that over my working career. I actively resist change, particularly in my farming operations, unless I get a damn good why reason. And I need to understand that. And I then need to understand how I can actually make a difference that's actually not going to trip me up in 12 months' time with another regulation coming down the path. So there's elements of that all through the decisions we make. I'm also looking at it from an animal welfare perspective rather than an environment. But perhaps I think more appropriately I could call it an animal environment, because actually, if we look at the Animal Welfare Act, it was revised in 2017. And one of the things it did was it placed in that legislation the notion of sentience of animals. In other words, they can understand and comprehend what's happening in the environment. They're actually affected by it. As part of the grazing or the intensive winter grazing work that's gone on, there's a number of questions that have actually been asked, and I know one or two of the examples I'll use here are not specific to deer. But if we think about the physical environment, we can also think around just what it is we're doing in terms of the internal environment or how we're affecting the animal's physiology. And there's been some fascinating work coming out of recent times, which actually throws up some challenges around the balance that we have in the diet, the dietary type, or the crops that we're actually using in diet, and the impacts when it comes particularly in terms of birth weights, growth rates post-birth, and particularly on fodder beets. So there's some challenges that are coming out as research goes along. And those challenges, I'm sure, will result in change management systems. So we're not at any point really just simply sitting on a fixed spot and not changing. We get new knowledge, we get new information, and we actually have to adapt to that. So the Taskforce findings were quite clear. It's not solely a farmer problem, it's a total system problem. From a farming perspective, I'm bombarded with all sorts of information around what a crop will yield, what a system will yield, what is the best type of system. And I'm trying to put that all together, and I sometimes have to trust the information I'm being given. I'm not sure on occasions that I should trust all the information I'm being given. So I appreciate it's a very, very difficult situation when you're confronted with, one, the information you've got, and secondly, rules overlaying and coming on top of it. So the Taskforce gave 11 recommendations. Some of those, the Winter Grazing Action Group are not going to be able to achieve. It's impossible to benchmark where we were 2 years ago, and we're not going to try. And I've told the Minister that effectively as well, because we are actually operating in a changing environment. It is about looking at the systems where they need to change, making individual decisions or collective decisions around some of the things that need to change. So in terms of expected outcomes, the groups worked with many other groups. So this group is pan-industry and government, but it's also working, ensuring that that dialogue is going on with regional councils as well. And just simply got it down to a number of short-term outcomes which we consider sensible. Now they are, if you go to the website, MPI website, there's a document that's about 6 or 7 pages, and it goes into some depth on each of those. I'm not going to try and go into those right now. First one, I know when deer tend to produce fawns, so crop in the middle of winter is probably not a relevant discussion that we can have. But it sure as hell is a relevant discussion for those of you that may be grazing animals that are pregnant, cattle that are pregnant, or lamb ewes on crop. And I've looked at some of the work, and some of the work suggests that even with really good management, 5% is sort of figure quoted, will actually calve in the middle of the crop. My question is why? Is it because we've pushed the interval too tight? We've forgotten about the short gestation length bulls that are being used in the middle of it. We've forgotten about sometimes the variation in gestation length that naturally occurs. And on occasions, we just might have to look at it and go, our records aren't that flash either. So if we expect to achieve an outcome like that, which is really what we're told we have to achieve, then we're going to have to modify some of our systems a bit. That may cost money, but that's the reality. probably more importantly, we're talking about prepared for weather conditions. That talks about a plan. It talks about a plan A, which is what you expect to do. It talks about a plan B, which is your contingency when it does turn to custard. And there are going to be occasions when that has to be implemented. That's the reality. Now, you may have a plan B in your head. You may have a plan A in your head as well. But when someone actually says what's going on here and you have not got it documented and you can't actually describe it well to whoever is investigating it, whether it be in an animal welfare or an environmental issue, then it becomes really tough. So the reality of the world is that we are moving to where we have to document it, but it also gives us some protection. It gives us ability to manage that risk a lot better, particularly if we're having to defend it, or if in fact we're actually relying on staff or contractors to give effect to it. Easy access to drinking water. That simply means, or people ask me what sort of water quality. It's not a muddy puddle. It's as simple as that. And it means that they're not tracking back, which is actually tracking back significant distances, creating environmental issues. And I think that's really very key to it. We plan for successful winter grazing. I don't think anyone plans to have an unsuccessful winter grazing, but we actually should make sure we're actually deliberately going in that direction. The pugging issue. Animals can lie down comfortably is where we've landed now. There are all sorts of discussions in the Taskforce recommendations. We're simply saying they can lie down comfortably and they can be observed to lie down comfortably. Now, you have to accept there's going to be 2 or 3 day periods where, in fact, that's not going to be easily achieved. The conditions can turn to a very severe situation in terms of impact on lying times and animals being able to lie down. As long as people then respond to that, coming out the other end of it and go, all right, we need to make allowance for it. We need to recognise that we can actually manage those animals and provide the right sort of environment once we've got through that tough period. We work together to provide care. And one of the challenges, and it's not so much deer industry, but certainly it is across the industries, is stop going out to grazing under the care of someone else. And I don't believe that in a lot of situations, the transfer of knowledge, records, and also what's expected is probably at the level that it should be. These are expensive animals. There is a duty of care that needs to be transferred, otherwise the person owning them is probably responsible. If you haven't got good instructions and things don't go right, you need to think about, did I manage that risk well? What comeback have I actually got? So I think we need to do quite a lot better than what we've been doing. And then finally, we just need to think of ways we can improve. And those solutions are going to come right across the sector. They're not necessarily going to come out of a regulator in Wellington. So don't expect them to come from MFE. MFE will tell the regional councils what to do, and the regional councils will say you got it wrong on occasions. So that's certainly going to be the case. They're solutions that the New Zealand farming community has managed to develop over the years and will continue to develop. I mentioned the regulations. They're quite straightforward. And as things change, things inevitably change, the Animal Welfare Act is likely to get reviewed. Regulations been enforced since 2015. There's codes of welfare. And there's some minimum standards for deer with minor changes in 2018. Now, I'm not going to go through any of that. The information's available. Sure, if you went to the association, you can get it. It's on websites. You just need to make yourself aware of what's actually happening. So, in conclusion, thanks very much. I haven't given and didn't intend to give you solutions. I think what we're dealing with is just making sure on the same page. It's a New Zealand-wide issue, not a local regional council issue. The exposure is high in central North Island. It is also high at Canterbury, Otago and Southland. Those are the areas that we need to recognise we are a bit exposed on. Collectively, I believe we just can continue to manage the situation, take it forward, show the initiatives that need to be shown. If we don't, we'll get dealt to. So thank you very much.
We have 5 minutes for questions, so I can see some burning in your head. Who's going to go first? Wow, really quiet on winter grazing, Graham.
Two excellent discussions there, and thank you very much for that. I don't think it's on. Oh, it isn't. Okay. What I'll say is, could we have a few more specifics? I know you said we can go to a website, but I think we should have a few more specifics about how you're going to handle all these conditions that you say are now requirements. Facilities to lie down, all the rest of it. It'd be quite good to add those resolutions to those problems that you've mentioned, rather than just directing us to a website.
Okay. So in terms of lying area, I think I'll go back one step. I can recall being asked the same little specifics when I had to chair an environmental group back in the 90s, and it was around significant waterways, or wasn't a significant waterway, and I got to the point where I said deeper than a red band and greater than a stride, and I've watched everyone try and define that further ever since. But I thought people could relate to it. It comes back to lying. If you come back to lying surfaces, there's going to be mud, but stock will actually find drier areas. Now, it may be quite simple. It may be as simple as taking down a back fence that you actually had and allowing them to go back where you can observe that the majority have been lying for a reasonable period of time. So it's issues like that. It also may be thinking about, even if you do get a suggestion of a top-down grazing operation and the weather's absolute shit, it mightn't be the smartest thing to stick them on top of the ridge and then watch what actually happens. So it is about giving more space. It is about portable troughs on occasions. It will be about making a judgment call as a skilled stockman and looking at those animals and going, I don't think they've actually laid down. They're just bunching in a corner. They've ploughed it. I'm actually going to have to shift them or consider giving them more area. But I can't give you more than that because it is soil type specific. There are quite significant differences from second country in the Central Plateau to some heavy soils down here. But it is about that shade or that shelter and lying areas. But we're going to get some compromises from time to time. We're going to have to accept that to a degree as long as we're not getting significant sediment runoff. So it's that trading that goes on in there. I can't give you a lot more detail than that, but I can actually circulate the detail that's on those pages to the dairy industry, and they can take it from there.
Sorry, I just had one follow-up from just to Graham's point, is that if you get a chance to come through the trade stand area, we've got a couple of examples there of farmers in Southland that have created plans, so what they're looking at doing, and also some of that information that Lindsay's just talked about. We've got some copies there that we can look at. So we're rolling out some resources to help deer farmers, but come and give us your input as well. So look forward to that. Thank you.
So this one's for Rob Phillips. Had a friend in Southland, and he said he fenced off the waterways, planted them out, and in a medium rain event he noticed that there was sediment coming into the waterway flowing through his property. So he tracked it back, and he said it was actually coming off the road, the gravel road. So to what extent will Environment Southland go to reduce that sediment coming off the roads? Or the council, sorry.
Yeah, the key thing is working out where the sediment's coming from and dealing with it. So whether it's a farmer or the road, we're not going to be. We've got to prevent that sediment getting in there. So if it's getting off the road in some way, then looking at how do you prevent that? I mean, you get sediment into waterways, even in a pristine environment, as you all know. But actually, how do you minimise that when you're in a farm situation? And is the key. So yeah, there's no recipe for this. It's just around how do we minimise that impact. And winter grazing is a key impact that can be
there. Rob, just wondering, just going slightly away from the winter grazing thing, but more about nutrient management and things. In Canterbury, we have zones, orange, red, etc. Just wondering how far along or where in the process of establishing how that stuff's going to be managed and determined in the future in terms of changing land uses and things like that.
Yeah, a really good question. We're not so Canterbury's a wee way ahead. We're going through that work now at the moment, looking at sort of shaping up what sort of reductions are required, and there'll be a plan change coming through. I think it's 2023, which will have a proposal for what those limits look like. But we do know, and what we're really keen to do is actually we don't want to wait until 2023. We want to look at what can we be doing right now to get ourselves and the community ready for that and on the path. We know the reductions are going to be significant, but actually we also know as I said before, we've got to do it in a way that maintains confidence and trust and get community buy-in, because we can only do some of this regulation. It's going to have to be your buy-in, and actually what can we be doing collectively to make this reduction. But it'll be 2023 is the short answer.
Will it be a catchment based rule or specific to farms or? Yeah,
so it'll be at this stage. We're working on catchments on freshwater management units. Yeah, we've got 4 in Southland, 4 main freshwater management units, and so it'll be based around them.